If we turn to the guitar, which some people may know a little bit about, I wonder if you could please just outline the background to why you built it in the first place and what it can do.
Yeah. Well, most of you probably heard the story before, but at least I can illustrate it with noises this time. I built a guitar because I couldn't afford one, basically. And a lot of my friends had things like Hofner Coloramas, which were the copies of things like Stratocasters and Gibson Les Pauls. And the whole thing was pretty new in those days. It was very, it was new to have a guitar which was solid and didn't have the traditional acoustic body. And the reason that people had made these solid guitars was so that they would not feed back, because they discovered if you put a pickup on an acoustic guitar and tried to play it on a stage like this, amplified, it would just make a horrible noise because the thing picks up from the room. So it was interesting for me, the time I started to get serious about playing when I was at school. I was about 7 years old and just completely captivated by the sounds that I was hearing from people like Buddy Holly and stuff. And then around me, I was very lucky. I was in the region of Twickenham and Richmond. I used to go down to Crawdaddy and Yelp Island, and there were people like Jeff Beck there who were using these solid body electric guitars actually to make feedback. And I was very intrigued by that. And I decided that when we made our guitar, it would actually be a guitar which fed back in the right way. I had all these theories. I don't know if I was lucky or the theories actually worked, but this thing actually does feed back in a way which I like. It will sing.
Well, it's actual definite notes rather than squeals, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, you want the feedback which goes through the strings as opposed to the feedback which goes in a way that bypasses the strings, because it will regenerate the note that you're playing.
And you get lots of different sounds out of the switching system on there. Maybe we could listen to a few.
Tell me what this sounds like? Give us a small amount of volume, Pete. we'll do the big amount later. Yeah. Well, the first thing is that this has an acoustic pocket in here, and most of this is hollowed out. So this thing looks like a solid guitar, but in fact it's pretty acoustic, but it doesn't pick up the low frequencies very much. It picks up the frequencies I wanted. I made my own pickups in the beginning, but the pickups didn't really handle strings being squeezed across, so I bought these for 3 guineas each in Burmans, in St Giles's Circus. And I discovered, it was all empirical in those days, I didn't know what the thing did, but I realised that if you had a magnet with a coil around it, put it under a string, the magnetic field would get changed and you would get a signal generated which you could amplify. And my amplifier was my dad's hi-fi, because my dad made everything, including helping me to make this little thing. So if you put a string, I discovered that if you put a pickup near here, near the bridge position, you get quite a harsh sound because it's picking up all the harmonics which are in evidence near the bridge. So you get this kind of sound. If you move your pickup further up the string, I'm sorry this is boring. Is anybody bored? Thank you.
You're still awake, Brian, all right.
This is all stuff you guys probably know, but it was interesting to me, so I thought I would just go through it. You move your pickup further down the string, you get different harmonics. And you get a much fuller sound. If you move even further up, you get to your pickup, which is next to the fingerboard, and it's more or less under the biggest part, the part of the biggest vibration of the string where you have least percentage of harmonics. So it's a very round sound like this. And that's a very pleasant sound too. What I discovered was that most pickups were wired in such a way on the commercial guitars that you couldn't make full use of all the sounds that you could get out of them. So I decided I would have a separate switch for each pickup and a separate polarity changer for each pickup. And what that meant was that I can turn each pickup around in polarity and cancel out some of the harmonics. So, for instance, you all know what this sounds like probably, but on this guitar, if I put these two pickups together, that's the bridge and the center pickup, it's a nice plummy sound, but it has a certain amount of edge because it's got these harmonics in it. If you turn this one around, in fact, if you turn either of them around, it sounds totally different. It sounds like this. Because the low harmonics are cancelling out. And both of these sounds are very useful. I didn't want to lose them. So hence this way of switching, which I think Fender actually copied on one of their guitars at one point. Similarly, these two pickups, these go here, a very round sound with these two. Turn one of them back to front, and you get this. And this emphasises the harmonics so much that they'll leap out of the things at a high volume, and that became a favourite sound for me for things like the solo in Bohemian Rhapsody, which I'll maybe show you later. Am I rabbiting on too much? Okay, well what happened was, I discovered if you turn the thing up really loud, it performs really well. So should we turn it up?
Mind your ears, folks.
I discovered that AC30s were the thing. I still love Vox AC30s, although Vox are incredibly unhelpful as a company. Sorry guys if you're here. Marshall are actually very helpful. But I love these amps better than anything, and for me they sound best if they're just given an extra kick with this little treble booster. This doesn't do anything in the way of adding distortion or changing the sound except to cut out a bit of the low end so that you can drive the amplifiers a bit harder. So it drives them into distortion, and Vox amplifiers sound very good when they're driven that way. So these, my favourite setting of all is these two together, just so you know. And it starts off being very articulate at low volume. I have to turn it on now. And as you keep going up, you get a little more distortion creeping in. But you can still hear all the individual strings, I think, all the individual notes. And if you go really loud, it becomes a nice kind of mush, you know. I've just been watching Paul Gilbert out here, I can tell you. that's impressive playing. But I discovered what, one of the things that made me feel happiest was playing an A chord really loud, which is what you just heard. And I think that's what a lot of us guitarists have in common. We just like the noise, we like the feeling that it makes. It's a very human, very kind of earthy thing. And it does something for our guts, right?
There was one question that we got from a guy called Hassan Zaidi from Shepherd's Bush. Hassan, are you in here, mate? Hello, hello. He was going to ask about the distortion box that you may or may not have had fitted in. Was that ever the case? But I don't believe I've ever
I did have a distortion. There was a thing called a Vox distortion booster, which at one time I mounted inside the guitar because I thought I needed the extra fuzz and the extra sustain. But this was before I had the Voxes. I had an amp, I think it was a Burns amp. I had a variety of them. And when I turned them up, they just kind of distorted in a very unpleasant way. So I used that to try and get the sustain, very much like, I think Jimi Hendrix used something very similar on the first album. But if you notice, if you compare the sound that he got on the first album, it's actually not as good in any way as the sound that Hendrix was getting live, that you hear on things like Monterey Pop, if you ever see that video. So after a while I ditched the fuzz box because I just preferred the natural sustain, the natural, not exactly square wave, but it gets driven into a very saturated waveform. I prefer the real thing which valves do and speakers do over what is basically a mechanical simulation, and then the fuzz box is a simulation of something being driven hard.
I mean, it'd be fair to say that you're probably in a unique position to have such success with basically exactly the same setup since day one, the same guitar and the same amp. Have you ever seriously considered using different amps, let alone using a different guitar for anything? Even in the studio?
In the studio, yes, I do use some different stuff, particularly the very small amp that John Deacon made. It's kind of what we call the legendary Deaky amp. And it has an amazing ability to make violin sounds, saxophone sounds or whatever, with a little help from me. So I do use small amps in the studio a lot, but for anything serious where My favourite place to play is just in that place between saturated and non-saturated, so you can hear the balls of the chords, but you can still hear the sort of articulation of the strings. And so playing in that area, nothing for me works like these things. I sound like an ad, don't I, really? Boxes, but they just do that. And to me, it's a big help to use the coin, because the coin can, depending on how it's orientated to the strings, produces a varying amount of articulation. By articulation, I mean when you can just hear one string peeping through the whole spectrum of the rest of it. So if the sixpence is turned parallel to the strings, it's quite a soft effect. Even though it's a piece of metal, it's a soft piece of metal. If you turn it sideways, and there's a whole difference between this sort of and this kind of. And I've always preferred the coin to anything else for that reason, and for the reason that it doesn't give at all, so you feel anything which happens at the string on your fingers. So I've never really liked soft picks. I just like this coin thing. Sixpences are very cheap these days, anyway.
You still find them?
Well, I find them. People find them for me.
Just go back to the amps for a couple of seconds. Are they basically stock models, or do they have any sort of tinkering with them?
Well, I'm pretty happy with stock models of these amps, except that if they go on the road, they're not very robust, and the valves get shaken around, and printed circuits get messed up. So we've had these completely redone inside by this man called Colin Peterson. Colin Peterson is one of the people who actually was on the team which invented these things, although he's freelance now. And he takes them to bits and puts them back together in a very simple way. He gets rid of all the stuff which I don't need, like a vibrato channel, like a brilliant channel, all the extra bits and pieces. He builds just a normal channel and the basic tone controls, and all the valves are in good quality, robust seatings, and instead of a printed circuit board, everything is hardwired. So it's exactly the same circuit and everything, except it's simplified, and it's just very robust, so you can take them on the road and they don't mess up.
You've been seeing a few copies before we get on talking about Greg for a while. Another question from, I can't remember his name. I do apologise for answering this question, but they said, what happened to the John Birch copy?
The John Birch copy was the first copy I ever had made of this thing, and it was always just a little lacking in tone. I think partly because the tremolo was a very lightweight affair, and also the neck was thinner. It just didn't have the sustain. And I had a particularly frustrating night. I think it was Chicago sometime, and I think I'd broken a couple of strings on this, picked up the John Birch guitar, and it just wouldn't happen. And in a rare moment of peak, I lobbed it over back there somewhere, and nobody caught it.
Probably still there then.
Yeah, well, the bits were sent to Guild when we were thinking about making the Guild copies of this guitar, and were never seen again. So I think somebody nicked them out of the Guild factory.
Guild BHM1, I've heard stories about them maybe being reissued or coming back. Is that true?
I don't have any plans at the moment. No, Guild have done 2 issues of the copies of this guitar, which the second one was a lot better than the first, I think, although they both have their points. But various things happened. They were taken over by Fender, and the personnel changes. And whenever the personnel changes, you lose that closeness. You know, they started putting out things which were not exactly as we'd agreed, so I didn't want to renew the contract when it came up. I'm open to offers. At the moment, Greg Fryer, who did some restoration of this little girl, a fantastic Australian guitar maker, he is up for making some of these, but they're going to be expensive because he really goes to town. He spends as long on making them as I did, and takes as much care. So he will be actually making some for sale in the next 15 years, probably. He's not speedy. He's the kind of guy who goes, well, I was thinking about making a start on doing a pickup today. And you know how Australians are.
But he actually went back to the beginning and redesigned the jigs and the tools, the same as
I discovered I still had some of the jigs, which was great, for like bending the frets, preforming the frets before I put them in, because everything on this thing was done totally by hand. There was no power tools, there's nothing. So I made my own tools, effectively, and Greg did the same, yeah.